Welcome to News from Neptune for the 41st week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a socialist government a century ago, who said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. Historians consider a generation to be about 25 years, roughly the time it takes you to get to the age your parents are now. For more than a generation, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of the program are available at archive.org. I'm now the age my parents would have been when we started the program, and my eldest son is the age I was then. It has not been an encouraging 25 years for the country at large. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for 3 generations. He wrote his first political article at the age of 10 on the fall of Barcelona to Franco's troops in the fraught year of 1939. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things in a Black October edition of News from Neptune. Black October refers not specifically to race, but to capitalism. October has been traditionally the time for stock market crashes in American capitalism, and apparently it's trying again this week to crash the market a bit. More importantly, and more notably, Black October 1993 in Russia refers to the attempt by President Yeltsin, backed by Bill Clinton's Washington, to crush the resistance of people against the Western-sponsored counter-revolution that followed the fall of the Soviet Union. The American government tried to turn Russia into a third world country, a supplier of raw materials controlled by foreign capital, and just about succeeded. It managed to so destroy the Russian economy that the life expectancy of Russians actually decreased, comparable, worse than it had in America during the Great Depression. What, in fact, was rejected in the uprising of October 1993 in Russia, which was suppressed militarily by President Yeltsin, shelling the parliament in order to stop the political rejection of his rule. What was being revolted against by the Russians was the transition, the brutal change from a socialized planned economy to a neoliberal market economy that Washington thought it could insert in Russia, indeed did do to some extent. And the reason Vladimir Putin is so hated is that Putin emerged from the wreckage of the Yeltsin regime to reverse the America's plans for the reduction of the Russian economy. So Black October 1993 is a memorial not remembered in America, but very much remembered in Russia. As usual, our thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson Research for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune's Facebook page. I have a list of 6 topics. Tried to keep it down this week, and then we'll go to David's.
Okay.
Number 1 is the danger to, even the danger to life of Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks, from the machinations of the American government and their attempt to capture, prosecute, and eliminate Assange and WikiLeaks. Number 2 is the recommendation of the program On Contact with Chris Hedges, which this week has an interview with Virginia Eubanks, author of the book Automating Inequality: How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish. A particular concern of our researcher, Dr. No, who's an expert on the subject, recommend that program entirely, and we'll say a word about that at some point. Point 3 is a reference provided by our former colleague Jamie Hutchinson, once a participant in News from Neptune, who points out that the Kavanaugh affair, the new Supreme Court justice, corroborates a theme that he used to defend on the radio version of this program, the theme that the only universal American experience was high school. He said, Jamie writes, something in the back of his mind said that Kurt Vonnegut was the source of that thesis, which he adopted, and Googling confirms it. 2 quotes from Vonnegut. 1, high school is closer to the core of the American experience than anything else I can think of. And that certainly captures an aspect of the Kavanaugh hearings last week. And Vonnegut also observed that true terror is to wake up one morning and discover that your high school class is running the country, close quote. And that seems true of the Supreme Court this week, too. Point 4, the forgotten to American media and immensely deadly war in the Congo should be recalled. America is a supporter and participant of the most devastating civil conflict in the world. Number 5 is the election in Brazil, where a right-wing candidate who perhaps can literally be called a fascist, the use in America these days is not often literal, was on the verge of election. Number 6, why the Democrats shouldn't be given control of Congress in next month's election, a point David and I have discussed before, and the discussion went on this week locally when I submitted a column on that point to the online magazine Smile Politely, which has published columns under the name News from Neptune, actually, on politics from me in the past, but refused to publish this one because of my departure from good order on suggesting that the Democrats should not be given control of the Congress. We'll talk about that. I advocated, amongst other things, a vote against the Democratic candidate for Congress in this district, and that was not to the editor's taste. David, your list?
Oh, that's it?
Yeah.
What was number 4 again on your list there?
The war in the Congo.
Oh, okay.
And
okay.
This,
just a minor thing there. Okay.
Well,
yeah. It's just a few
Dr. No has provided an interesting summary of something that is excluded from American news, and the ongoing and murderous war in the Congo doesn't make it into the not just the headlines, but indeed to the body of the news.
Yeah. Number 1 is a quote from that was referenced by Karl Boggs, an old socialist from the 1960s. He writes, and he's quoting the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, reflecting on the socialist impasse at the end of World War I, who wrote, quote, "Illusion is the most tenacious weed in the collective consciousness. History teaches, but it has no pupils," end quote. And along those lines, came across a interview on the World Socialist website about an upcoming movie about the Peterloo Massacre, coinciding with the 200th anniversary of the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester, England, which will be coming up next year, 16 August 1819, or next year will be 2019, of course. When cavalry charged into a crowd of 60,000 to 80,000 who had gathered to demand the reform of parliamentary representation, killing 15. And the movie is made by the well-known, excellent British filmmaker Mike Leigh, L-E-I-G-H. And he, in this interview, he's quoted as saying the following: "Of course, we decided to make Peterloo knowing that the bicentenary was coming up. Bicentenary is coming up. It's next August. And yes, I did grow up in Manchester. I could get to where the massacre happened in 15 minutes on the bus when I was a kid. But here's the interesting and remarkable fact. We didn't really know about the event growing up. Nobody talked about it. Why? as primary school kids, we weren't taken down there a short distance and marched around and told, "This is what happened here." I have no idea. Mike Lee says. Working on, and then he continues, working on the film, there were people of various generations, from their 20s to people of my age from the area, who said, "I didn't know about this." And yet the massacre was widely reported and is a famous, significant, and seminal event in the history of democracy in Britain, the labor movement, etc. So I'll look forward to seeing that movie when it comes out next year. And of course, the famous poem, as Carl, as you know, written about Peterloo by Shelley, right? The next topic, the possible abduction and murder of the Saudi journalist Khashoggi, Jamal Khashoggi, which is creating various A is still mysterious, but B is creating various covered responses in the media, from all the way from Thomas Friedman, who is his friend, but who was also an avid supporter of the Saudi ruler Mohammed bin Salman, doing a sort of Thomas Friedman doing a limited modified hangout, as they used to say, in Watergate regarding how we deal with this. On Counterpunch, a fellow named Will Solomon writes, titles his column, "Tom Friedman Reaps What He Sows, the Disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi," and excoriates, Will Solomon excoriates Thomas Friedman for the obvious and blatant hypocrisy of Friedman in the way he deals with this. Solomon writes, "Friedman has spent the last year, probably longer, whitewashing the newest Saudi leader and insisting the country is on a path to reform. Note that the linked piece was published only last November." So, and then Solomon goes on to sort of compare this disappearance with what Saudi Arabia is actually doing in Yemen with American support, and to a certain extent Thomas Friedman's downplaying of sort of equalizing the conflict in Yemen, as if it were just as much the fault of Iran as it is the fault of Saudi Arabia, and indeed the United States, without whose approval and support it couldn't go on. A very interesting note, number 4, a very interesting note in the media this week, or a very tragic note followed by a very interesting note regarding the 20 people killed in a limousine crash in upstate New York. And it turns out the owner of this limousine company, the shady owner of this limousine company, was used as an FBI informant early in the 2000s, after the War on Terror got going, in one of these phony FBI sting operations that entraps down-and-out Muslims and sent them off. One of those took place in an upstate New York City called Newburgh, Newburgh, and there was an HBO documentary film, which one can view on YouTube, regarding the nature of this sting. And so what goes around comes around in this regard. The shady character enlisted by the FBI to do these things was also the shady owner of this very dangerous limousine outfit, which ends up in the death of 20 people. And okay, so number 5, I also have Brazil down here partly in terms of the whole issue of neo-fascism and what neo-fascism might be, whether we want to apply it in this country, in Europe, or Brazil. It seems to me it appears that there's a better case for seriously applying the word neo-fascism to the possible possible ascendance of Bolsonaro to the presidency or prime ministership in Brazil. The best source that I've found for that, there is an article on Jacobin written by 3 authors, in which is summarized in this way: the core of Bolsonarism is hatred of Brazil's organized working class, which today, despite no threat of socialist revolution, is incarnated in the PT and the image of Lula. But what I would highly recommend is the American person in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, who has reported well for years on these things, Brian Mier, M-I-E-R. An interview with him can be found on the Real News Network, and also a half-hour interview, sort of supplementary interview that one can access at This Is Hell with the host Chuck Mertz. And he talks about it in very specific terms, the rise of this party, and just what the relative strength of Bolsonaro is versus the PT and those other parties that in the runoff, which of course only have the PT versus Bolsonaro, the PT represented by a fellow named Haddad, who replaced Lula when he was sent off to jail as part of this overall coup, which got rid of Dilma Rousseff. That's a way of being relatively well. I would suggest that source, Brian Mier, to be relatively well informed about what's going on there right now and what's coming up in 3 weeks. Briefly, number 6, the New York Times is trying to sort of what with the resignation of Nikki Haley from the United Nations, the New York Times article, opinion editorial board article was Nikki Haley will be missed. And
yes.
That could be taken in any number of ways, but what the New York Times editorial board is doing on behalf of the neoliberal and neoconservative establishment in this country is kind of nuance Nikki Haley as being representative of those people, among those people trying to quote unquote, or my quote unquotes, bring Trump back to this establishment view. So Haley is all of a sudden sort of the modified darling of the people in power in this country. And there's a lot of talk about what her political ambitions are, the assumption being that she's going to run for president one day. Mm-hmm. So that's something to keep our eye on. Here's a brief quote from the New York Times editorial, just to give you a flavor of that, of how they're approaching this. With no background in foreign affairs, a deficit for a presidential candidate, which she was running for president, she accepted the United Nations appointment and became one of only a half dozen women in a cabinet-level job, as if it matters how many women are in a cabinet-level job. And Indian American, she also became one of the even smaller number of people of color at the top of the administration. So Nikki Haley gets points for the New York Times Identity Politics editorial board for being a woman and an alleged person of color. Kind of nuts, really, kind of nuts. A nice article by Vijay Prashad on ZCOM comparing, again, Cuba with Puerto Rico in relation to recent hurricanes. And what he coins a phrase called disaster socialism. He says it is a key part of Cuba's landscape. Its people are organized into voluntary units, and its infrastructure is decentralized to mirror the decentralization of governance on the island. And finally, number 8, an article in the New York Times by 2 of their young neoconservative Zionist columnists, or columnist being Bret Stephens, member of the editorial board Barry Weiss, a woman, B-A-R-I, Weiss. Why is Israel scared of this young American, referring to the woman who's been detained for the last week or so, who wanted to go study at Hebrew University, but is being detained by the Israeli government because they discovered that she'd been involved in a group in college that had supported the BDS movement. What Weiss and Stephens are doing here is the good old modified limited hangout in trying to cajole Israel to be a little nicer in a liberal sort of way and not give this person such a hard time while reinforcing their support for the Jewish state. And they write, I think wrongly, Theodor Herzl's vision for a Jewish state was not the ethno-state of Bannonite fantasy. I know you like that, Carl. Well, but an open, pluralistic society. Liberal societies thrive not by expelling critics, but by tolerating and even assimilating them, and therefore defanging them. That's the point of having critics. You've got to defang them by being. Right. This is nuts in so many levels about what Israel is, who Herzl was, what Israel became partly on the basis of Herzl's vision, and the way that Barry Weiss and Bret Stephens are soft pedaling what Israel has become, as if the fact that it can aspire to be liberal in the context of what it's done to the Palestinian people is a serious argument to be making. So that's my 8 points.
Thank you very much, David. You're watching News from Neptune. We're talking about various interlocking shows, yes. Our show is a discussion of interlocking elements from the week's news under the general rubric of Black October. Once again, that's not a racial comment, it's a comment about the economy and the American suppression of the Russian transition from the Soviet Union. A major contribution, if you want to put it that way, of the Clinton administration was reducing the lifespan of Russians. I have a series of comments, David, on the things that you brought up, so in no particular order. Your initial line from Gramsci, history teaches but has no pupils, it seems to me an important one, and central to what we're trying to do here, suggesting that history needs a few more pupils, and if we can do anything to encourage that, we're happy to do so. The article that's taken from by the energetic Carl Boggs, who's written for years on important matters, is a very good article about the Democratic Party, which I will return to. Yeah. And the article is on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. I recommend it. Upcoming movie on Peterloo is very interesting to me on two scores. First of all, the general notion of upcoming movies happens to include a film produced by my daughter called The Front Runner, which will open about Election Day, or will open in November, a story of the 1988 presidential election and Gary Hart, who was removed from that election, even though he was a front runner, because of a scandal that was encouraged and allowed, in some sense, by the Democrats. Recommend that film, and I'll have more to say about it as time comes, not just because of the personal connection, but because the film is obviously a historical-based commentary on some of our current embroglios. Second, on Peterloo. Peterloo was the massacre of a popular uprising in a popular protest in 1819 by the British government. It was called Peterloo in imitation of Waterloo, which 4 years earlier had spelled the end of the Napoleonic Empire in France, and the British were deeply involved in that. And by way of imitation, Peterloo was coined to refer to the British government's attempt to reduce labor agitation in Britain. It is often referred to by Jeremy Corbyn, the current head of the Labour Party, and I have a note about that here. And Corbyn suggested to a huge audience in Glastonbury a year ago, quote, "If I may, I like to quote one of my favorite poets, Percy Bysshe Shelley." Jeremy Corbyn politely suggested to a huge Glastonbury audience, the crowd of nearly 120,000, more accustomed to the boon of headline acts. It's a scene of rock concerts, than elderly men reading out romantic poetry, roared its approval. Quote, "Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number," he rumbled. "Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few." Close quote. This is Jeremy Corbyn rallying the troops, we might say, of British Labour in a rally a year ago. The Labour leader told the crowd that this was his favorite line. It's the final stanza of Shelley's 1819 poem, The Mask of Anarchy. Neither mask nor anarchy mean exactly what we would use those terms to mean today, so it takes a little while, and the best thing to do is to read the poem. The poem was written in response to the Peterloo massacre earlier that year, when a cavalry charged into a nonviolent protest for the vote. Though it was not published in Shelley's lifetime, it was first released in 1832, the poem has become a rallying cry for peaceful resistance. It's been recited at uprisings throughout history, from Tiananmen Square to Tahrir Square. Corbyn's turn on the Pyramid stage, the rock venue, was not the first time he used it. He recited the stanza during his closing speech on election night in Islington, and the audience began quoting along with him. Islington was the district that Corbyn represented in Parliament.
Well, he still does, right?
It still does,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
exactly. It's become a sort of watchword for the Labour Party and what should be the eventual Corbyn prime ministership. A note on the Khashoggi business from Gary Brecker. Gary Brecker has written for a long time under the name, under the title, The War Nerd. He's someone interested in, concerned about matters of war, for a variety of publications across the world, and has recently published a translation of the Iliad, the poem of force, as it was called by the story of the war at Troy, and famously termed the poem of force, and a translation informed by his own attention to contemporary war literature. I recommend it very much. It's almost as good as its own way as Emily Watson's wonderful new translation of the Odyssey, the companion piece from ancient Greece. Brecker writes, "There's something odd about the Khashoggi affair David just described. All the wrong people are sure he's dead. And dead would be stupid even by MBS standards." MBS here refers to the effective ruler of Saudi Arabia right now, Mohammed bin Salman. They didn't kill Hariri. Hariri was the Lebanese prime minister and who fell into Saudi hands apparently on a visit and was detained apparently for a while. They didn't kill Hariri or the corrupt oligarchs. These were the Saudi wealthy who were imprisoned by Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi government, and basically forced to fork over a good bit of their money in order to get out of this Saudi prison. I sort of, it's as if our president should imprison Warren Buffett until he paid up. That's essentially what they did. If Brecker says if Khashoggi were a nobody, he might be dead. If he was a Shia, he'd certainly be dead. But he's a person by Saudi families, a person by Saudi family standards, so he may turn up missing a fingernail or two, i.e. a victim of torture. I don't know if Brecker's right. Brecker's smart and is well informed. I think he may be wrong about this. And there's an interesting notion being put about by Pepe Escobar, a well-informed international reporter. He says there are rumblings in Langley, that is at the CIA, that a Saudi colonel could terminate MBS with extreme prejudice. Terminate with extreme prejudice is CIA talk for murder. That the CIA, in other words, is contemplating the removal of the effective head of the Saudi government on the Khashoggi affair. Why? Because Khashoggi, the Pulp Fiction victim in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, was CIA, and writing, by the way, for the Bezos Post, the Washington Post, to boot. Still, MBS goons went medieval on him. Well, yeah, maybe. What actually happened to Khashoggi isn't clear, but it is turning into an international contretemps, and the notion that the CIA was behind him suggests, as Escobar does, that it may extract revenge of some sort from the Saudi regime, and MBS, the head of the vicious Saudi regime, may be in some danger. Perhaps we should look forward to that.
Well, another angle to that, and perhaps it's a kind of a weak read, but given all the controversy about whether or not we should support the Democratic Party and that we should do so on gaining power in Congress, and given that part of the argument for that is that there's enough Democrats, 40 some odd Democrats, who oppose the war in Yemen, or who have legislation that would forbid the United States from providing the weaponry for that war, that this might be a factor as we move forward in how this plays out at the political level, if politicians feel like they have to respond to this in some way. It's kind of a stretch, I think, because these things happen, and then if the establishment wants the public to get over it, they get over it, and then it's not heard from anymore. But this seems different because, I mean, after all, this guy was friends with Thomas Friedman.
Oh well,
so that makes a lot of difference. You don't go pushing off the friends of Thomas Friedman.
But it was nevertheless the case that when Mohammed bin Salman seized power in Saudi Arabia, he actually took it out of the hands of another Saudi prince whose name was Nayef and was known as the CIA's point man in Saudi Arabia. That is to say that, and Saudi Arabia and the CIA have a long relationship that goes back, includes people like John Brennan and so forth. The notion that Mohammed bin Salman's seizure of power went counter to the wishes of the CIA is background to the notion that Khashoggi, dead or alive, was also apparently a CIA man, and that the CIA may decide to take its own revenge against the leader of Saudi Arabia, and they may be more effective at it than the Democrats. I think there's at least a possibility of that. While we're talking about the CIA, we might mention the tragedy of the 20 people killed in a limousine crash in upstate New York that David talked about, and the revelation that the man in charge of that operation who's now been charged with murder.
Well, it's his son, I think. Well,
That's right. That's true.
Yeah.
But this was also an FBI, CIA.
Yeah.
This is the intelligence community at work.
Yes.
And there are 20 dead upstate New Yorkers as a result, including some children.
Yeah. And I recommend Louis Proyek's piece on that. I think he was right on top of it. So I criticize Louis a lot, so I'm going to give him credit for this.
We'll make sure that Louis' piece is on the Facebook page for
And there's a link to that film that was that HBO film on that in that piece also.
Good. Brazil, the rise of fascism in Brazil that looks like being accomplished by the election of the Bolsonaro. Once again, admirably discussed by the Brazilian-American correspondent Pepe Escobar. We'll put that comment too on the Facebook page. And finally, what else did I want to mention here? The contretemps around the American student imprisoned in Israel right now seems to me particularly interesting because it seems to be so much about so little. I mean, anybody being imprisoned and also by an oppressive government, that's always an issue. But in this case, I think it reveals just how frightened the Israeli government and its supporters are by BDS. And we've had occasion to criticize aspects of the BDS campaign here in the form put forward particularly by Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein and some others. But the fact of the matter is that the Israeli government takes it very seriously indeed, as shown by this particular event, and the contribution being made by this young woman to an international discussion of the condemnation of the Israeli government's behavior might be substantial.
And by the same token, one can see when one sees a response to this by people like Barry Weiss and Bret Stephens, hardcore Zionists, one also senses that they're very concerned about Israel's image and about the hits that these obviously repressive measures do to the image that they continue to try to cultivate in this country, that Israel is just this liberal state with a few flaws, and if only we could just figure something out and the Palestinians would go along with this or that, and that the BDS people would stop being so strident, then we could all make nice, and the Middle East would be this peaceful place. But what one looks back at, I was reflecting this week for some reason on what has happened in the last 40 years in the Middle East, roughly since the fall of the Shah in 1979, or if you go back to the 1960s, one has to ask oneself, how different can the world possibly be and still be the same? Because in the 1960s, one couldn't possibly imagine a future in which Israel was no longer being threatened by the other Arab states, was no longer being threatened by the Gulf states, when Israel's only ally in the region was the Shah. So now you've got a thing where there's all this has changed over time, but Israel still has to have this one enemy, and that says something about what its role is in the region vis-a-vis U.S. power, and B, what its own ambitions in the region are.
You're watching news from Neptune. I've mentioned earlier the contretemps regarding the suggestions about how the election should be conducted, how one should vote in the upcoming election. And my theme has been all along that the Democrats, as the more pro-war party, as the party of Russiagate, which condemned Trump's apparent overtures to the Russian government shouldn't be given control of Congress in the next election. And the even more apparently disturbing suggestion of what that means in the 13th Illinois Congressional District. But I think there is a general point here, and one that the article referred to earlier by Carl Boggs, I think, makes very well. We're not going to build an anti-war movement today by voting for Democrats. The war-making that the Trump administration inherited from the previous, remember, Democrat administration in 8 countries, and its escalating war provocations against Russia and China will hardly be reduced by the Democrats, whose presidential candidate in the last presidential election was a noted warmonger. That's Hillary Clinton. As Secretary of State, Clinton presided over war provocations from Ukraine to the South China Sea, to say nothing of the destruction of her managing to turn the most advanced country in Africa, that is Libya, into a hellhole. These were the contributions of the Democratic presidential candidate in the last election. Trump became president in part because of his criticisms of her support for war in Iraq, Libya, against Russia, and against China. Now, this is post-election surveys showed that this indeed did influence voters. This is the way, paradoxically, we might say, Russia did influence the presidential election by being the occasion of Trump's criticisms of Clinton's warmongering. So after her defeat, the Democrats ginned up the fantastic Russiagate charges. Trump is a traitor, remember, was the main burden of Russiagate. Trump is a traitor who's secretly working for the president of Russia, who's an enemy, of course. None of this was true, none of this is true, but that's what the Democrats promoted after the election. The reason they did it was not just annoyance and bad faith, but the very real fear by the American political establishment that Trump might mean it when he suggested that the hostility, the open hostility, the growing hostility of the Obama administration against Russia and China might not be continued under a Trump administration. That was what came out of the election. The most flagrant war supporters in the U.S. government, the so-called neoconservatives or neocons, fled en masse from the Republican Party to the Clinton campaign because of the fear that Trump might mean what he said. There's hardly much indication that he did, but the overtures to Korea and the apparent willingness of Trump to talk with the leadership of Russia did, to some extent, confirm the neocons' fear that American belligerence might be lessened in a Trump administration. I think we're going to have to vote against Democrats in the most effective way possible if we're going to counter this settled belligerence against Russia and China. But remember, of course, the elections in America weren't set up to give us an honest result. The point of the American election system, as the historian of the Constitution, James Madison, said, was to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. The majority in America has always been anti-war. Before the First World War, before the Second World War, before the Vietnam War, or at least during the Vietnam War, the American popular understanding always had to be cajoled and conditioned by the American media in order to get the U.S. to go to war. Americans didn't want to in the 20th century, but one way or another, they were engineered into it, often by getting the enemy to apparently to strike the first blow, as Lincoln had done at Fort Sumter, for example. But the result was a history of American warfare, which since the Second World War has managed to kill more than 20 million people around the world in defense of the profits of the American 1%. That's quite a record, and a tribute as much to the American propaganda system that took a basically anti-war public and convinced them to go to Tarawa or to join the construction battalion in the Second World War, as both of our parents did. The situation now is a struggle over convincing Americans that war and warfare are necessary. There are fundamental economic reasons as well as hegemonic reasons for this. The increase in the American war budget, the military budget just passed, the increase is greater than the entire Russian military budget. That is the percentage added in this Congress. So in fact, the propaganda works, and there are a lot of people interested in seeing the propaganda work who profit from that military budget and profit from America's control of the world, established as it was in the Second World War. The current results are a politics in which we have no anti-war party, and those people who suggest, well, the Democrats are the more anti-war party are perhaps the most deceived. To quote the Boggs article that we started with tonight, socialist revolution is not on the horizon. While its historical agency, who accomplished it, would never be the Democratic Socialists of America or the Democratic Party in any case. For those DSA activists still genuinely committed to democratic socialism, the ensemble of structural and ideological obstacles posed by the grand party of neoliberal globalization and imperialism, the Democrats, is sure to be insurmountable. Don't vote for the Democrats. They don't do well, and it is not an anti-war vote in any sense at all. My suggestion that means that in this district we have to vote for the feckless Republican incumbent for the House seat from this district has caused a good deal of upset, including by my friends at the online magazine Smile Politely, which refused to run an article of mine suggesting that. I've been writing political articles for Smile Politely off and on for a while, and Smile Politely is a distinctly worthwhile publication, the heir to a long tradition of so-called alternative publications in Champaign-Urbana, and I'm sorry that they find the suggestion so threatening that it can't even be introduced into the limits of allowable debate.
So what are the responses? What are the possible responses that one might have on behalf of the beleaguered Democrats? One is the aforementioned 40 plus members of Congress who might want to do something about Yemen or other aspects of the American war machine or the extensions of the American war machine in the Middle East. Another might have to do with the Iran deal and the supposed dismantling or the actual dismantling of the Iran deal. Not without Europe's help, the Iran deal maintains itself in that context, and that Democrats were, for whatever reason, behind Obama's efforts to put the Iran deal into place. Another argument might have to do with the general tendencies of the Democratic and Republican parties towards about global warming and climate change. After all, when you're voting for Republicans, you're voting for climate denial, and that isn't to overplay the actual substance of what the Democrats' opposition or what the substance is of their support for what actually needs to be done in that context. That's sort of all I got right now. I plan to vote Democrat, and hopefully that have some influence over what the Democratic Party does among those people who are now claiming that we need to vote for them for these quote unquote anti-war anti-war reasons.
And
So, yeah.
I'll vote Republican. We'll cancel each other out.
We'll
and
cancel
both
each other out.
Both write letters in the new administration.
I mean,
There
I
we
wouldn't
are.
necessarily even be advocating for that, except for that, you know, I mean, the Republicans, first of all, it looks like if anything, the Democrats might recapture the House,
Yes.
but not the Senate.
Yes.
So they're already being canceled out there. So you don't have anything to worry about.
I agree with your analysis up to the last line.
So, but there's another angle here, and that is, there's a lot of one of the leaders of the Democratic supposed anti-war movement who's having a lot of faith put in by our I guess we could say friend and colleague, Bob Naiman, a California congressman named Ro Khanna, who represents Silicon Valley. Kind of a strange relationship there between Ro Khanna and the Democrats and Jeff Bezos even. It's like he apparently was part of the move to get Jeff Bezos to pay Amazon employees a minimum $15, whatever that means. And there's been real dissent and real contrarian views about what the meaning of that is.
Yes.
In terms of A, whether it's really helping out
Right.
Amazon employees, and B, and apparently Bernie Sanders was involved in this, what I would consider to be a rather suspect effort who's being played here?
Yes.
Who's being played?
I think that's exactly the question.
Is Bezos being played, or is Bernie Sanders being played?
The smart money and all the rest of the money too, by the way, is on Bezos.
Yeah. So what do you do with it? I'm surprised by some of the people who have been so sort of over the top and enthusiastic about this so-called progress. Not that it might not be a good thing for some Amazon employees to be making $15 an hour instead of whatever they were making, but then again, some employees apparently are having other benefits taken away from them.
Right.
So I don't know what the bottom line of all this is, but it seems the enthusiasm is not worded on a number of levels.
My suspicion, and it's no more than that, and maybe actually a hope masquerading as a suspicion, my suspicion is that Bezos and friends, and as you suggest, the increase in wages for Amazon employees is probably almost literally lunch money for Bezos. It really doesn't count for much at all. My suspicion is still that the oligarchs in American society really are worried about this cross-party enthusiasm for a universal basic income and the various tentative movements we see across the country for raising wages locally. They really want to forestall that, and they want to forestall even a discussion of a universal basic income, which, remember, has been part of American politics for a while. The most serious suggestion by this came from the Nixon administration, believe it or not. It's worthwhile reading the history. And it suggests that what we're dealing with here can't be nicely isolated as a one-party problem. It's part of the growing populist move in American politics, the very move that produced the Trump presidency in the first place. So I think they're worried.
Yeah.
And I think that moves like this by oligarchs like Bezos are an attempt to hold that back. Fine, let it go, but let the movement continue. Let the conversation continue about the legitimacy of universal basic income for all Americans, along with the arguments for free health care, free higher education, and so forth. That's the debate we really mean to have, and the Democrats, in good Bernie Sanders fashion, are in some sense sheepdogs for that debate, pretending to be part of it, but in fact trying to bring people back into the consensus that exists before. The Bezos move is an attempt to restore that consensus by making that argument go away.
Yeah. And of course, Bezos wants to accumulate all the wealth in the entire world.
Yes,
He wants to be that, when they do that Gini coefficient thing, and if it's one, it means that one person owns everything and everyone else owns nothing.
He takes it seriously.
Let me suggest. Let me just. This is out of bounds, and we don't have much time. But Bezos is of Lebanese background, or of I think. I mean, he was an immigrant to this country. Sometimes people like that aren't necessarily on board with what everything that this government is doing in the Middle East. Jeff Bezos is concerned mainly about making money and getting along with the other people who make money. It's possible that Bezos isn't really down with the neoconservative point of view, or with he may be an outlier in some sense among the ruling class in his foreign policy views. I don't know. Have you seen any evidence that might be the case, or does he ever say anything? I don't know.
No. You think I'm the dreamer by saying we should vote against the Democrats?
To me, there's something little dim light came on at some point in my reading about. I wonder what does Jeff Bezos really think about all this stuff? And this Ro Khanna is his congressperson.
Mm-hmm.
He's in this. Ro Khanna is his congressperson, and apparently Ro Khanna has developed, for better or worse, this collegial relationship with Jeff Bezos, again, who is being played here. But then Ro Khanna is trying to burnish his foreign policy credentials in regards to being anti-war. So we might keep those balls in the air and see how they fall, if they fall, if there's any future evidence that supports any of this understanding of how this little part of the world works.
In connection with this, I'm going to conclude by announcing that I want to put this remarkable discussion with Chris Hedges on automating inequality, how high-tech tools profile, police, and punish, showing the way in which government surveillance is doing what it can to make sure that movements like this don't get out of hand. Mm-hmm. We owe Dr. No this account, and it's very much worthwhile paying attention to. You have been...
So we actually have 3 or 4 minutes in case there was anything else you wanted to... I wanted to mention, as an after, we didn't get into a talk about fascism and what it is and what it's not, but pretty much what it's not is a pretty bad interview that Amy Goodman did this morning. I just looked at the transcript before I came in. A philosopher at Yale named Jason Stanley has written a book called How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. And it seems if one looks, he's got this list of 10 things about what fascism is. And it's hard to read that list and really make the argument that if this is true, then fascism is kind of what we've had for quite some time. So I don't, and who else is at Yale that's making a similar argument? Timothy Snyder.
Timothy Snyder.
Of course. So
the Yale fascists.
Amy Goodman did, there's good Amy and bad Amy. Amy did a great story about the, New York upstate limousine thing. And she did a good story earlier this week interviewing Rashid Khalidi about various foreign policy things. But this is bad Amy. This Jason Stanley stuff, that's bad Amy. And I'm not buying this way of understanding fascism. I think we have to have a series, when we get back to talking about, Brazil and what may go down there, then we can start having a serious conversation about what fascism or neo-fascism might be, because I think Bolsonaro might be the real deal in that regard.
Well, it would be worthwhile to rescue the term from a mere term of abuse used by each side. You're fascist. No, I'm not. You're fascist. To rescue the term and make it, in fact, analytic, to say something about what it actually means and whether it's useful at all. In historical analogies, always limp. This one seems particularly splay-footed. But I think we've got to be clear on how we're using the term, not just as abuse.
And I think Chris Hedges is also sort of using that. There's good Chris and maybe not so good Chris, but still he's referring, and I take Chris Hedges seriously. He refers to people like Robert O. Paxton and Fritz Stern as the people who the historians who best define that, but I'm not necessarily on board with recent interviews that Chris has done in that regard, publicizing his new book, which is called America, the Farewell Tour.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So anyway, we can leave that on the table for some other time.
You've been watching News from Neptune
Unless the fascists get us first.
for the 41st week of 2018, a Black October edition. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. Our thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, the third man on News from Neptune. No's notes are posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.